Greetings. This is Zahir Nali from the Solve MECFS Initiative, welcoming you to our 2016 webinar series. We have a very special guest with us today. We have the world's foremost expert on MECFS, and I'm also proud to say a member of our Research Advisory Council, Dr. Anthony Komaroff. Dr. Komaroff will be updating us on the hot areas of MECFS research and giving us an overview of the field. Just briefly, and we do not have enough time to list all the accomplishments of Dr. Komaroff, but very succinctly, Dr. Komaroff is the Simcox-Clifford-Higby Distinguished Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and a senior physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He has held several leadership positions. We will list some of them here. He was the director of the Division of General Medicine and Primary Care within the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's, a founding editor of a publication of the New England Journal of Medicine, an editor-in-chief of the Harvard Health Publications Division of Harvard Medical School, responsible for all Harvard Medical School's consumer health publishing. This includes books, newsletters, internet content, magazines, and newspaper columns. Dr. Komaroff was the co-director of a program in clinical effectiveness, a training program in non-laboratory investigation. This includes clinical epidemiology, biostatistics, health policy, etc., which trains approximately 300 fellows per year from institutions around the world. Dr. Komaroff is also the author of a daily newspaper column that is syndicated by United Features Syndicate in 450 newspapers in North America. Dr. Komaroff has published over 240, can I repeat that? 240 research articles and book chapters, in addition to 2 books. In the past 20 years, his publications have been primarily focused on myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and the biology of clinical consequences of infection with human herpes viruses. Dr. Komaroff has been a member of multiple committees on MECFS and related illnesses convened by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and National Academy of Sciences. In recognition of his achievements, Dr. Komaroff has been elected as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American College of Physicians. Finally, his research related to MECFS was the basis for his receiving a special recognition award from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And believe me, folks, this is the short version. Dr. Komaroff, we are thrilled to have you today. Thank you for doing this. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nali. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, let's get to our goal for today is to talk about several hot areas in MECFS research. I'm going to briefly revisit the controversy about MECFS that began in the mid-1980s and going to review the evidence that I believe should put this controversy to rest. And in doing so, I'm going to really describe the hottest areas today, at least in my opinion, in understanding the underlying biological underpinnings of MECFS. So let's begin with the controversy. And the reason for the controversy is pretty easy to understand. The illness has been described or defined exclusively by subjective symptoms, something that anyone can say that they have. So doctors wondered, and sometimes friends and family and employers wonder, is there really anything wrong, meaning anything objective that you can measure going on that's wrong in the body, underlying biological abnormalities? And if the answer to that question is yes, could those biological abnormalities theoretically explain the symptoms? And if the answer to that question is yes, do the abnormalities, in fact, correlate with the symptoms? Those are the sort of the three questions that the skeptics properly asked about 30 years ago. In my opinion, each of them now has an answer, and the answer is yes. And I'm going to summarize just a little bit of the evidence that I believe supports that statement. Last year, 2015, there was a very important report from the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences and the Institute are the primary organization in our country to review controversial areas and make a scientific judgment about the controversy. This panel of about 20 experts issued a 300-page report, and that panel worked hard. They reviewed over 9,000 scientific articles that have been published about ME/CFS, and they concluded that ME/CFS is indeed a biologically based illness. And they also proposed a new case definition and name, which I won't be focusing on today. I want to focus on the evidence of a biologically based illness. The National Institutes of Health also had a meeting and drew the same general conclusion as the Institute of Medicine. And then late in 2015, the director of the National Institutes of Health announced that there would be an expanded research program, both on the NIH campus as well as expanded research support from the NIH to scientists all over the country and indeed all over the world. Likewise, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has expanded its research program and also is in the process of expanding and updating its information for the general public. The Institute of Medicine gave readers of their report some sense of the seriousness and scope of the problem. Using data that largely was collected by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, they estimated that between 836,000 and 2.5 million Americans have ME/CFS, and that the direct and indirect economic costs of that each year to the United States is about $17 to $24 billion. So a problem of importance in that way that got a lot of people's attention. There's also growing interest in ME/CFS all around the world. For example, just 2 weeks ago there was a conference in Japan that I attended that was also attended by some of the top neurologists in Japan, dedicated exclusively to ME/CFS. And then just a little more than a week ago, the 12th International IACFS-ME conference, research conference, concluded. It was a 3.5, 4-day conference with scientific presentations from scientists all over the world. So there's really a growing effort globally to understand this illness. So what are in my view, the hot areas of research? Well, they involve the brain, they involve the body's response to exercise, the immune system, energy metabolism, what I'll call and define later epigenetic studies. And then after describing these hot areas, I'm going to put forward a hypothesis that I think ties together a lot of these areas and that is increasingly the focus of research. So let's begin with studies of the brain. There are hundreds, perhaps as many as 1,000 scientific published papers on studying the brain in different ways in patients with ME/CFS. There are studies of the hormones the brain makes that affect hormones throughout the body. There are studies of thinking. How a person thinks has a lot of different elements, and there are now pretty accurate tests for measuring how well a person is thinking in each of the different aspects of thinking and cognition. There's lots of evidence that a part of the nervous system linked to the brain, the autonomic nervous system, this is the part of the nervous system that controls what are called the body's vital functions, the heart rate, the breathing rate, the body temperature, things like that. There are MRI scan studies. There are SPECT scan studies. There are PET scan studies. These are all different ways of taking pictures of the brain, and they give different information. And then finally, there are EEG or brainwave studies. That is yet a different way of studying how the brain is working. And all of these technologies have been applied to patients with ME/CFS, and then they're compared to healthy people or to people with other fatiguing illnesses like multiple sclerosis or like depression. There are hundreds of these studies, but I will just present a few pieces of evidence from the hundreds of studies. One study has found reduced gray matter in the brain in patients with ME/CFS. The gray matter are the cells in the brain that do the thinking, and cells adjacent to those cells that help defend the thinking cells against attack and keep the metabolism of the brain going. Here you see two groups of women, younger women on the left, older women on the right. Patients with ME/CFS in red, healthy individuals in green. And as you can see, the amount of gray matter in this study among both young women and old women was less than in the healthy individuals of the same age and obviously the same gender. This is a SPECT scan. The details of it don't matter. It's showing you something about blood flow and metabolism in the brain. And the only point I want to make with this example is here on the right side of the brain you see a lot of yellow, a lot of signal, and that's close to normal. This is close to what you would see in a normal person. It's not entirely normal because this is an ME/CFS patient. But now look at the left side of the brain, and there's very little signal over there. And on the day this picture was taken, that person was having lots of problems with odd sensations on the opposite side of his body. And the brain, the way the brain works is one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. So this picture was exactly what I expected to see given the symptoms of the patient, and clearly objective evidence of an underlying biological abnormality. There have recently been a whole series of new studies of what's called connectivity in the brain. Basically, these are different ways of asking a simple question. When one part of the brain is activated, does another part of the brain that normally talks to it also get activated? Do they move in sync, in tandem, or are they discoordinated? When one area lights up, the other area that should light up doesn't, or at least there's a delay before it does. This connectivity can be measured using a variety of techniques, and at the IACFS 12th International Conference that just ended about a week and a half ago, there were several studies using different technologies that all concluded that in the brains of patients with ME/CFS, there is a discoordination in the communication or the connectedness between different regions in the brain. So to summarize very briefly a huge literature of scientific research, here is the conclusion I would draw as of today. There are many different techniques for looking at the brain that have been used to study patients with ME/CFS, and they all say something is wrong. They don't say what's wrong, but they say something is wrong. They do not say that the problem is a permanent problem, a progressive downhill problem. In fact, what they seem to say, it's a problem that can come and go. The cause of the problem remains obscure. We don't know what it is. It's possible that at least in some people there's an infection of the brain or another part of the nervous system. Or it's possible that there is an immune attack on parts of the brain. I'll come back to describing this in a minute. But these are reasonable possibilities, but they're not proven. Now let's turn to a second hot area, which is what's happening in the body with exercise. And that's an important question because one of the cardinal features of ME/CFS that is pretty distinctive, you don't see it in other illnesses, is what's called post-exertional malaise. The fact that physical exertion or sometimes cognitive exertion can make a person have a flare-up of their symptoms. Not immediately, not while they're exercising, and not immediately thereafter, but typically the next day, 12 to 48 hours afterwards. We've known for years that that happens. Now we're beginning to try to understand why. What's happening in the body that makes people feel worse after exercise? The muscle is surely involved in this, and there are several different lines of evidence that there is something wrong in the muscle and in the connection of the brain, which directs the muscle with the muscle. For one thing, in patients with ME/CFS, there is what's called central sensitization. That's a decreased pain threshold. I press with a certain amount of force on your muscle. If you're healthy, doesn't hurt. I press with exactly the same amount of force, no more, on someone with the muscle of someone with ME/CFS, and it hurts. They're more sensitive to any kind of pressure or pain or stimulus. Secondly, there's something called oxidative and nitrositive stress. This is a biochemical process. I'm not going to describe or define it, but it is abnormal throughout the body, in the muscle, in the brain, and elsewhere. There's also evidence that the muscle energy function, the energy metabolism of muscle, is impaired in various ways. And the same thing here, bioenergetic dysfunction. Many lines of evidence that say this, only a few of which I'll touch on today. Here's one example of data, of evidence that I think is pretty easy to understand. It's the level of acid in the muscle both before a person exercises and after a person exercises. So here on your left, you see patients with ME/CFS in the black bar on the right and healthy control subjects on the white bar on the left. And you see that at rest, the levels are about the same. This is the pH, which is a measure of how acid the muscle is. And these levels are normal at rest. But then, after exercise, what happens is, in the healthy control subjects, the level doesn't really change, changes very slightly. But in patients with ME/CFS, the pH goes way down, which means that the acid level goes way up. Clearly a difference in the metabolism of muscle caused by energy, a difference by exercise, a difference that could explain why people feel weak when they exercise and after they exercise. There are various studies of post-exertional malaise, exercise-related studies that were reported at the IACFS-ME meeting that just ended a week and a half ago. One study from Stanford found that during exercise testing, there is a characteristic gene expression signature involving 15 different body chemicals, molecules, that were expressed differently in patients with ME/CFS than in healthy people during exercise. I'll come back in a second to what I mean by gene expression, because there were many other studies of gene expression at the meeting. Another group from the University of the Pacific did what I think is a very important test. They did a standard exercise test, and then they asked people to repeat that same test 24 hours later. And they did that with patients with ME/CFS and people who were healthy. And what they found was that on the repeat test 24 hours later, the ME/CFS patients had trouble getting their heart rate up, whereas the healthy patients had no trouble getting their heart rate up. Another physical difference between patients with ME/CFS and healthy subjects. Finally, with exercise, following exercise, another group from Georgetown University found that the blood pressure tends to drop when people stand up following an exercise challenge. Another study from the University of Wisconsin and yet another one from Nova Southeastern University in Florida found that during exercise, people with ME/CFS cannot consume as much oxygen from the blood. And you need that oxygen for your muscles to have the energy they need to exercise. And furthermore, that when patients with ME/CFS no longer can use oxygen, they turn to a different source of energy called anaerobic metabolism. And they do that much earlier in the exercise program than healthy people. The result of this is that acid, blood lactic acid or lactate, builds up in the blood, in the muscle, throughout the body. And this was shown most dramatically by another study in which one exercise test was followed by a second exercise test 24 hours later. What happened was, in patients with ME/CFS, the lactic acid level in their body, in the blood, in the muscle, was higher than in the healthy people, and it was even higher the second time they exercised than the first time. But healthy people, they conditioned themselves with that first exercise test, and when they did the second test 24 hours later, their acid level was even lower the second time around than the first time around. So to summarize, because I'm not sure I said that clearly, there was an opposite reaction in the tendency of acid levels to build up in the body of ME/CFS patients and healthy control subjects. It built up, the more they exercised, the more it built up in ME/CFS, but in healthy people, the more they exercised, the less the acid built up because their muscles were healthy and able to became more conditioned with each additional exercise. Now let's turn to studies of the immune system. For 25 years, there have been many studies in the literature that showed immune system abnormalities. And these are the sorts of immune system studies that were possible to do in the 20th century. Studies of the levels of what are called cytotoxic T cells. These are immune system cells that go on the attack against foreign things. They're higher in people with ME/CFS. Studies of natural killer cells, another type of immune system white blood cell that is important in defending against viral disease. They're not working very effectively. They're trying to work, but they're not working very effectively in patients with ME/CFS. Differences in an immune system set of molecules called the 2,5-A system. Details don't matter. Very different in ME/CFS from healthy people. And then finally, an increased production of what are called pro-inflammatory cytokines. These are the molecules that the immune system uses to coordinate its efforts when it's going to war against something foreign. Now, last year, 21st century kind of immune system study was published. Now we have the technology we could only have dreamed of 25 years ago to study in the same sample of blood 51 different immune system molecules. And we did that. I was a part of a study that was headed up by Dr. Mehdi Hornig at Columbia. A large study, nearly 300 patients with ME/CFS from 6 different sites all over the country, compared with 350 nearly healthy individuals of the same age and sex. And then the study by design looked at patients with ME/CFS who had been ill for less than 3 years and compared them to those who had been ill for more than 3 years, and then compared both of these two ME/CFS groups to healthy controls. Compared them with the levels of each of these 51 different cytokines, and they found that 28 of the 51, the majority, were turned on, were at higher levels in the people who had been ill less than 3 years. But that by the time people had been ill longer than 3 years, that those levels started to drop and became actually a little bit lower than they were in healthy people. It was as if, and this is just an inference, we can't prove it, it's as if the immune system was fighting so hard for so many years early in the illness that finally it just got pooped. It wasn't as good at fighting the war, at making these molecules, these cytokines that it uses to fight the war, and lost that ability, or at least became less vigorous in doing so. Those were studies of these levels in the blood. But what I've said so far implies that the real problem in this illness probably lies in the brain, because the symptoms of ME/CFS are experienced in the brain. And there's plenty of reason to believe that these immune system molecules, if they were elevated in the brain, could be causing the symptoms of ME/CFS. And how do we know that? We know that because some of these immune system molecules we can actually make and do make and use as treatments for different kinds of diseases. And as soon as we were able to do that, we learned that when you have an intravenous in a person and you start infusing into their bloodstream one of these immune system cytokines, within a very few minutes they start to develop the symptoms of fatigue and achiness and low-grade fever and other things that are common parts of ME/CFS. So it's what we were looking for in this study, again centered at Columbia and led by Dr. Mehdi Hornig, was whether there are differences in these molecules in the brain itself, or at least in the spinal fluid that bathes the brain. And the answer was yes, there are. They are higher. This study compared patients with ME/CFS, here in blue, patients with MS, multiple sclerosis, in red, and then healthy controls. And as you can see, both in ME/CFS and in multiple sclerosis, the level of this particular cytokine and many others were higher, very significantly higher than in healthy people. A study presented at the IACFS meetings was, this one from Stanford, was another huge study, nearly 200 patients, nearly 400 healthy people of the same age and sex, and the same 51 cytokines measured as in the study from Columbia that I mentioned just a moment ago. And again, this study found that many of these cytokines were turned on in ME/CFS, and more importantly, when they studied the level of these cytokines and compared it to how severe the person's symptoms were, they found that the higher the level, the more severe the symptoms. In other words, that this molecule, this chemical in the body that we're postulating may be causing the symptoms of the illness was higher when people felt sicker. And that is evidence in favor of that molecule actually being a cause of the symptoms. It's not proof, but it's pretty good evidence. Another kind of immune system study or set of studies that have been published in the scientific literature include what are called autoantibodies. These are parts of one of the ways the immune system uses to attack something foreign. But in what are called autoimmune diseases, for reasons we don't understand, the body starts to make these antibodies not against things that are foreign, but against the body's own tissues. And there are many reports of that happening in patients with ME/CFS. Antibodies against different parts of the body, blood cells, different chemicals in the brain and nervous system being prominent among them. Whenever you talk about an immune system that's activated, that's turned on, of course the question is raised, why? What is it fighting? What is it trying to fight? Well, one possible explanation, at least in some patients with ME/CFS, is that it's fighting what it perceives to be an infection with some foreign microbe. So what's my view of the role of infection in ME/CFS right now? I think there is now pretty solid evidence that ME/CFS can follow a new infection, some types of new infection. That is, that an infection can trigger the illness, can start it off. It's also possible that some of those infectious agents that can trigger the illness may be the cause of its chronicity, of its continuing, that they may perpetuate the illness. That's plausible, but it has not been proven. And then finally, we know that several of the agents that have been shown to trigger ME/CFS cannot be fully eradicated by the immune system. Fortunately for us, when we're infected by foreign microbes, most of the time, our immune system can wipe them out completely. But there are some microbes that cannot be completely eradicated. We live with them for the rest of our lives often. And some of these microbes have been linked to ME/CFS, and some of them also are capable of infecting the central nervous system or the brain. So that raises the question that I'll come back to in a moment: could the symptoms of this illness, in some patients at least, result from a chronic low-grade encephalitis or infection, inflammation in the brain? So summarizing, again, a very large scientific literature on the immune system and ME/CFS, I think it is fair to conclude that the immune system is activated. It's been activated by something in many people, most people with ME/CFS. What has activated the immune system is unclear, but infectious agents are a plausible possibility, at least in some cases. And then finally, we are learning now that immune system activation in the brain or near the brain and the nerves that lead into the brain could also explain many of the symptoms of ME/CFS, and I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. All right, energy metabolism and what I call oxidative and nitrosative stress. About 15 years ago, someone at an IACFS research conference suggested that maybe the reason that people with ME/CFS lack energy is that their cells are not able to make energy as efficiently as in healthy people. To me, at the time, that seemed unlikely, a little simplistic, but I was wrong. I think there is now abundant evidence that in people with ME/CFS, there is indeed an impairment in the body's ability to make energy, in the cells of the body's ability to make energy. Several different kinds of impairments because the body has several different ways of making energy. There is defective production of energy molecules, the best known of which is ATP. There are physical abnormalities, perhaps, I think that's a little less solid scientifically, of the mitochondria, which are the parts of every cell that are important in making energy. And then there is oxidative stress in patients with ME/CFS, and that's known to damage mitochondria and to impair energy metabolism. Now here's an example, and I alluded to it earlier, of acid in the brain that is reflecting a defect in energy metabolism, because this acid, lactate or lactic acid, is produced when the brain can't manufacture energy efficiently from oxygen. And what you see in this study is that the levels of that acid in the brain of patients with ME/CFS are clearly higher than they are in people who suffer from anxiety or people who are healthy. And another study found the same thing in patients, or close to the same thing in patients with depression. There was a difference, a lower level in depression as there is in anxiety. At the IACFS conference, there was a report from Oslo, Norway. There's a team there that has been testing a treatment called rituximab for ME/CFS. You may have heard about that. They had nothing new to report on their treatment because the study that's underway now won't end until next year. But while they were doing the study, they were studying energy metabolism in their patients. And they found a specific defect in energy metabolism that involves one particular enzyme. And they speculated that the reason for that defect might be this autoimmune disease that I referred to a minute ago, or autoantibodies that are affecting the production of this critical enzyme in energy metabolism. Another study from Britain found that the white blood cells of ME/CFS patients don't produce energy as well as those from healthy subjects, and that was particularly true when you expose those cells to stress. So as patients with ME/CFS can tell you, when subjected to stress, physical stress, cognitive stress, emotional stress, stress in life of any sort can make the illness worse. Here's a study in which the cells of people with ME/CFS, when subjected to stress, start to misfunction to a very much greater degree than cells from healthy people. Now let's turn to epigenetic studies, another hot area. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly but for lack of time. You've heard about genetic studies. We've been studying how disease is caused by defects in the structure of genes for over 60 years. And we've believed that most disease probably was caused by defects in how a gene was built. Just to summarize sort of basic biology, genes are like a string of beads. And genes make something called mRNA, which is another kind of a string of beads, and mRNA makes proteins, which is yet another kind of a string of beads. When there's a defect in one of those beads in the gene, it leads to a defect in the mRNA, which leads to a defect in the protein. The point is that the shape or the structure of the gene affects the shape or structure and function of the protein. And we've figured most disease is caused by this sort of a defect. But now we're learning that disease is caused not just by mutated or defectively built genes, it's also caused by perfectly normally built genes. They're not mutated, but they're not turned on or turned off at the right time. This is called epigenetic. It means there's something wrong with the turning on and turning off of genes. And there are many different ways of studying epigenetic phenomena in ME/CFS patients and in many other diseases. And now we're seeing those studies start to roll in. This is a hot area. And they're showing what you might have expected, given how broad the number of biological abnormalities is in this illness, that there are epigenetic differences in patients with ME/CFS. All right, so I'm going to conclude with a hypothesis, which is that low-grade brain inflammation causes the symptoms of ME/CFS, and this involves a connection between the brain, the immune system, and possibly, in some people, the gut. So what I'm saying in this hypothesis, which is not mine alone, other people actually have prompted this hypothesis more than anything I've said. But there are different factors that can trigger ME/CFS, but the hypothesis goes they all end up causing low-grade inflammation in the brain. And that low-grade inflammation causes the symptoms of the illness. Now, that inflammation could be caused by an infection inside the brain that the immune system is constantly attacking but cannot eradicate, and the consequence of it is the ongoing symptoms of the illness. Or the inflammation in the brain could be caused by an autoimmune process, as I've described a minute ago, or it could be caused, and this is the genuinely new area of interest, it could be caused by inflammation or infection somewhere else in the body that sends signals to the brain. So what do I mean? When you get the flu, you know how bad you feel. When your pets get sick, you can tell they're sick because they're sort of acting the way you feel. They're not moving much. They're not eating much. They look unhappy. They sort of look like that. Why? Why do we feel sick when we get the flu? We're now learning that actually the flu doesn't, except in very rare cases, doesn't directly affect the brain. The flu affects the lungs and other parts of the body. But when they get sick, they send signals to the brain through the blood and through the nerves that connect the body to the brain. And those signals say to the brain, cool it. The body needs energy to fight this infection, to fight this inflammation, so don't use a lot of energy in other things. Don't move much, don't eat much, digestion requires energy, don't have a lot of social activities, sleep a lot, don't have much sex. It causes symptoms that tell the body to slow down, to preserve the energy, to heal, and to fight the infection. That sickness behavior is a way that we help heal an acute infection, but the question is, if there were chronic infection or inflammation in the body, could you have chronic sickness behavior? Could the body feel like, as so many patients with this illness say, it feels like I've had a flu that never went away? I'm going to skip that slide because I've said that. Now we turn to the gut. We've learned in the last really just 5 years that we've known forever, we've known for a century and a half, that our body has on it and inside it lots of different microbes that live on us, with us, our entire lives. What we've learned in recent years is there's lots more of their cells than there are of our cells, and they have lots more genes than our cells have genes, and that they make chemicals that affect our health. Now, how could they affect our health? They could affect our health, for example, by producing a low-grade inflammation in our gut that is sending signals to the brain that there's inflammation here, there's sickness here, you should be sick, and that they could actually prompt the immune system in the brain to get active as if it were infected. Is there any evidence that the immune system in the brain is active in patients with ME/CFS? Well, there's only one piece so far of direct evidence, but it was pretty impressive. It's a study from Japan published a couple of years ago, and what matters here is how high these dots are. As you can see, these dots, they measure inflammation in the brain. They are much higher in all of the patients with ME/CFS than they were in the healthy control subjects. So this is one piece of evidence that indeed there is chronic low-grade inflammation in the brain caused either by a process in the brain or elsewhere in the body that is sending signals up to the brain, sickness signals. So to summarize, we really still don't know the cause, the pathogenesis of ME/CFS, and in fact most of us who study this illness believe there are almost surely multiple possible causes or triggers. We think that the case definition of this illness, each of the case definitions that have been created, may not actually be perfect. They may not completely encompass a single illness, but they probably encompass a set of similar illnesses with different triggers that all share common symptoms. We don't yet have tests that constitute a diagnostic test that say for sure you either have or do not have this illness. But there's been some encouraging studies published in the last few years that, if they hold up, may signal the way to such diagnostic tests. And we don't yet have any proven treatments. So that's the bad news. The good news is that I think we can now say, to address the controversy that we began this with, that this illness is not simply something that people are imagining that they have, with symptoms that they imagine that they have. That this is not a primary psychological disorder. What we, I think, now have abundant evidence of is that this illness involves the body and the brain, and that it involves the immune system specifically, energy metabolism specifically, and what are called oxidative stress and nitrosative stress that negatively affect energy metabolism. It is possible that this illness really reflects a sort of a chronic sickness behavior caused by signals that sickness somewhere in the body are sending to the brain, through the blood and up the nerves that lead to the brain. It is possible that this activated immune system in the brain that we have theorized for many years may be the cause of the symptoms is in fact increasingly plausible. That the studies are showing that such activated immune system in the brain does exist, and that it could explain the symptoms. And finally, it's possible that at least in some people with this illness, what is triggering the brain and sending sickness signals to the brain is changes in the microbes that live in our body, particularly in our gut, that if that turns out to be right, we might be able to fairly simply fix and hopefully improve the symptoms of the illness. So those are the hot areas, and that's the hope that I take from where research is leading for the possibility in the coming years of good diagnostic tests and treatments that give a lot more relief than treatments we have today. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Komaroff. Wow, that was a fascinating overview. Thank you so much. Only Dr. Komaroff can do this. We have a few more minutes. Let me go directly to some questions, and I would like to sneak in one on my behalf very quickly. Regarding the recent Stanford study, the large study on the immune modulators and their levels, it seems that, as you eloquently described, the level of cytokines seems to correlate with disease severity. The other study from Colombia, the other great study as well, argued that it is the kinetics of the disease, the duration since the onset, rather than severity, seem to bin and categorize these elevated level of cytokines. Do you have any insights on how one can reconcile these two?
Yeah.
Kinetics versus level.
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think you're right. The evidence of the levels of these cytokines in the blood does suggest a difference between disease severity affecting the levels and disease longevity affecting the levels. And there appears to be a discrepancy there. I would bet, but we don't have a lot of data on this yet, that when you're talking about the levels of these immune system molecules in the brain, that you're not seeing the same attenuation over time with longevity of the illness. And in fact, it's my understanding from the one study that I showed you that did look at the levels of cytokines in the brain or in the spinal fluid, that there wasn't, it was a small study, but there didn't appear to be a drop-off in the levels of these illnesses, of these cytokines in people who had been ill longer. So I think that is, it's a very good question and it needs to be answered, but the only answer for it, in my opinion, are much larger studies that include patients who've been ill for varying lengths of time, studies of the brain, cytokines in the brain or spinal fluid, and those studies are going to take a while to do.
Certainly, thank you. Thank you. There's another question from here, from the viewers. How soon, and I'm asking these questions exactly as I'm reading them, how soon will we see approved drug treatments, and which will be the first to be approved? This is a hard one. I shouldn't have asked that, but how soon do you think, Dr. Komaroff?
Well, it is hard because you're asking me to be a prophet, and
yes, yes.
Yeah, I like to be a prophet
from your
about
experience. From your experience with FDA approvals.
Yeah, I was going to say I like to be a prophet. I'm very willing to be a prophet about what happened in the past. I just don't like to be a prophet about what's going to happen in the future. FDA,
Understood.
First of all, the biggest problem here is that the drug companies need to see an opportunity because they need to fund the research that the FDA needs in order to approve a drug as a treatment for any disease. And right now there hasn't been a lot of action on the part of the drug companies in finding treatments for this illness. My hope is that as the research gets more robust and as the research identifies targets that drugs could hit, for example, as the research increasingly suggests low-grade inflammation in the brain, there are treatments that drug companies have on the shelf and in the bank that could theoretically damp down that inflammation in the brain. And they might get interested in doing the funding that's necessary to prove that those treatments would make people feel better. But I'm not optimistic we're going to see FDA-approved drugs for this illness, let's say in the next 5 years, because I just don't see the evidence of funding the kind of research that's needed so far.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Komaroff. This is another one, and I am going to have an addition on this too. Is there a correlation between histamine and ME/CFS? Histamine and ME/CFS. Now, I say this, my addition here is that just recently an exciting paper came out on tryptase secretion, which is also secreted from mast cells with histamine, alongside histamine. And in that paper in Nature Genetics, the patients they looked at have a slew of symptoms, including dysautonomia, including sleep disorders, including pain, a variety of symptoms that looked very much like ME/CFS. They call them, unexplained medical syndromes or complexes. So they argued that tryptase, an enzyme secreted from mast cells, could be a cause here. And the question here is on histamine, which is secreted also alongside tryptase. So what's your insight on histamine, perhaps in allergy, perhaps in that context?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and when I saw the paper that you're referring to, I was reminded of the fact that 25 years ago, we did studies of histamine. That seemed to us a very attractive possibility. And a few of our patients with ME/CFS also have other illnesses that definitely are affected by histamine. However, the studies we were able to do 25 years ago really weren't good enough kind of studies to answer the question, and we sort of set it aside. And I had set it aside until I saw the paper you referred to. So I agree with you that that paper could be pointing us in a useful new direction.
And, thank you so much. Let me sneak in one. We are over past the time, but maybe one more. To what extent are different researchers with their different focuses converging on a single generally agreed explanation for the cause of ME/CFS and the mechanism or mechanisms that maintain it? I guess this is a general question on the agreement about a single mechanism, which from your talk I surmise there is still disagreement on a singular, but I'd like your insights on this.
Right. Well, I mean, what we know is there are a lot of different abnormalities involving a lot of different parts of the body, and the challenge is how do you tie them all together with a single explanation? I think that the closest I can come right now is the hypothesis that I put forward, that chronic low-level inflammation in the brain caused by something like an infection in the brain or caused by inflammation elsewhere in the body, that would unite a lot of the different abnormalities that have been reported in the literature. Theoretically, it would unite them. But whether in fact it explains all of them, that is going to take a lot more work to determine.
Yes, thank you so much. And then I promise you this is the last one. We at the meeting we were at recently that you talked about in Fort Lauderdale, the IACFS meeting. There was a mentioning of a study from Finland, I believe, on low-dose naltrexone. That study did not show statistical significance, if I remember correctly, although low-dose naltrexone is used widely. Now, we don't have a position on this. We don't recommend it or not. But as a physician, as a practicing physician, in light of these results and in light of the interest in this particular drug, is there any insights or recommendations, again, as a clinician, that you would like to add?
Well, yes, I would say I don't think that the evidence that's been published so far about naltrexone justifies its use in ME/CFS. I'm not aware of any substantial serious risk from it, but I don't know that it really has been shown to be effective. But the studies that have been published are pretty small studies, and when a study is small, you can't conclude, if you see no statistically significant difference, you can't conclude that there is no difference, because the study was too small to find a difference, a real difference that might exist. So I just don't think we have the information we need to make a judgment about that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Komaroff. I have to tell you, we have 98% retention still of our attendees, which I've never seen at this late hour. So thank you so much. I'd like to, again, extend my appreciation to our viewers and listeners for staying with us, and to thank you so much for giving us this amazing overview and for answering these questions. I appreciate that very much, Dr. Komaroff.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nale. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you all, and we will see you in our next webinar.